Let's review a replica of a historical Paratschwert or Paratschwert from VB Swordshop. Hey folks, Matt Easton here of Schola Gladiatoria. Now this was sent to me a few weeks ago by VB Swordshop, aka Victor Berbekucz, and this is the manufacturer of this particular sword. There's their manufacturing mark there. Now you might think, oh, this is just another feather, Matt, why are you showing this to us? Well, I review any feathers that are sent to me, and there is actually a huge amount of variation. First thing, I'm not going to labour this point, just to say the Paratschwert probably historically was known as the Paratschwert and were used in very specific ways. Some that we know more or less how they're used, some things that we don't know. But the fact is that they didn't have fencing masks and they weren't using them in exactly the same way as we use them today. You'll notice many feather these days have rolled tips or things like that, which aren't historical. These broad spatulate tips are actually the most historical type of tip. But moreover, the physical characteristics of a lot of the feathers that you find in the modern world don't match the historically surviving originals that we actually have in museums and private collections. Now, this one is different to that, and that's why this is so different to, as far as I can think, every other feather that I've ever reviewed or even shown on this channel. This is essentially a historical reproduction. This is a replica, or at least purports to be, and we'll talk about that in a second. It's in theory a replica of an actual historical Paratschwert or Paratschwert, for all the good and the bad that that might mean. To be more specific, this was an original example that was discovered, as far as I'm aware, by Roberto Gotti in Italy. That's not to say it's necessarily an Italian Paratschwert, which I've seen some people describing it as. I think it's probably still German, because for the most part these types of swords seem to have been from the German sphere, and I don't know of any historical evidence of ones exactly like this with the schild being used in Italy. But nevertheless, it was discovered in Italy by Roberto Gotti, and then Roger Norling made some studies on it as well and decided to use historically proportioned feathers within his own club's practice. So it's in many ways a step away from the modern sporting feather. The main characteristics of how it's different. First of all, it has a large spatulate broad tip. Okay, it's not a rolled tip or a typical thickened tip. It is a broad spatulate tip. That is, the blade is narrow here and gets broader towards the end. This is something we see in a number of surviving originals. The next thing is the weight. So let's talk about the weight. So this is on paper 1.67 kilograms. Which is heavy for a feather. By modern feather standards, I think the Pavel Mok, one of Pavel Mok's ones is the only one that really matches that. 1.67 kilograms. Now actually I just weighed this. This is actually 1.685 kilograms. So this is actually even slightly heavier, this particular example. The next thing is the point of balance. So a lot of modern feather balance really quite close to the cross, and this of course reduces the energy with which you're hitting people, so it makes them a bit more user-friendly for sparring. On paper, this model balances 9 centimeters out, which is described as being a long way out, and it's going to hit really hard, especially when this is heavier than a typical one as well. So you've got this combined feature of it's heavier than normal. It's also longer than normal. It's 104 centimeter blade. That's 41 inches for the other imperial people here. 41-inch blade, so it's pretty long, certainly quite heavy, and it has a point of balance far out. Now, this is in terms of the review, this is something to pay attention to for a second. I have just measured the point of balance on this sword, and it's 15 centimeters out. Now, if I had ordered this sword hoping for a 9 centimeter point of balance, I would be pretty annoyed that it was actually a 15 centimeter point of balance, because that is a significant difference. In terms of how a sword handles and moves, that makes a huge amount of difference. On this particular sword, it makes an especially large difference because this is a 41-inch blade, 1.68 kilograms, as opposed to the 1.67 kilograms shown on paper. And when you move the point of balance from 9 centimeters to 15 centimeters, that makes a big difference. Not just in how hard it hits your training partners, but also how quick and responsive it is to move, both offensively, defensively. Just the characteristics of its movement, its points of rotation all change. Okay, so that's worth noting. The other thing is the looks of this thing. It does look exactly like the pictures of the originals I've seen. The only exceptions being, as far as I can see from the photos of the original, is the grip is different. This grip is leather covered, and the pommel has slightly different proportions to the original. It looks to me in the photos like the original pommel is perhaps a bit shorter, but is a bit more flared, is a bit wider. So that might be an artifact of the photos. I don't know. I've only seen a couple of photos of the original. One photo, in fact, of the original. So, nevertheless, we took this to my club because I am not primarily a longsworder these days. I do still teach longsword to beginners, but I almost never teach intermediate or advanced longsword, and I very rarely fence longsword these days. So I took this along to my club where some people in my club used it. So first of all, we're going to have a look at their using of it, bearing in mind this is longer than normal, heavier than normal, point of balance further out than normal, and let's see how they found it to use. Hi folks, so here we've got Jack and here we've got Stephen. So how did you find this very large and quite beefy feather? How did you find it?
Heavy, and getting the momentum going wasn't easy. But the more you used it, the more you got used to it.
Did it feel longer than you're used to?
I wouldn't say longer. It was just harder to get moving.
Okay, so a bit sluggish.
There was one time in particular when I cut through, and the momentum just took me some further.
Okay,
it took me longer to get back to what I was expecting. So
I think that's it. It's like resistance training where it's just getting it moving. But once it's moving, it didn't feel as bad as I thought it was going to, based on just waving it around.
So it did feel more cumbersome and heavier than a normal feather, but not as much as you thought it would.
no, not at all.
Right, okay.
There were a couple of times, especially when you're coming in with high hits, and I thought I parried, but I don't know if it's massive or whatever, it just powered through and still caught me.
The problem is that because it flexes in the middle, not at the end.
Yeah.
A normal parry doesn't work as well because it bends around.
So the next thing I was going to ask was about the flexibility. How did you find the flexibility?
You could feel it wobbling around, but it wasn't as big a deal as I thought it was going to be.
Okay, because it does feel a bit more wobbly, doesn't it, than a standard feather, than a lighter feather, because you've got more weight towards the end of the blade, I think.
It felt better in sparring than just waving it around.
Okay.
Yeah, and it didn't hit as hard as I thought it would.
So that was going to be the next thing I was going to ask is, so how hard does it hit?
It was a little bit harder than normal feather.
But were you being a bit careful with it?
We were starting off a bit careful.
Yeah, we got towards the end, I think.
We ran something.
I caught you in the middle.
But that was more, I was annoyed at getting hit.
Okay.
But you feel it a bit more, but nothing.
So you need to be a bit careful with it, but it wasn't murderous. It wasn't.
I wasn't scared of being hit with it.
Okay.
Because I started with it first, I was really quite worried about doing anything, but actually after a while it's okay.
So how did you find the heavy one here, the VB?
I mean, I think I'm tired today, but even then, like the point control was kind of off. Like,
right.
I think if I got used to it, I could probably get there. But because the point of balance is so far in front of the hands,
okay.
There's some techniques I tried, just like the basic, point switching around, winding, and it just wasn't quite.
So you found it more sluggish, more difficult to control, a bit slower.
Yeah, a bit slower.
Yeah.
I thought like if you drop the point on the other guy,
yeah,
you can do that quite nicely. But you have to be in exactly the right spot.
Yeah. Okay. Cool. And what did you find? So you were on the receiving end of it quite a lot. How did you find being hit by it? I mean, Pedro was being fairly controlled with it.
It was fine.
Yeah.
I didn't. Honestly, like the flat was a bit different.
Okay.
But didn't hurt.
Okay. Cool. So used with control, it can be safe because we've just demonstrated it can be used safely.
I think if it didn't seem like what a full-on thrust would be like, but barring that, I think everything else is okay.
Yeah. Cool. Okay, Gary. Thank you very much.
Thank you, man.
So hopefully that was illuminating, and hopefully it's also nice to get other people's opinions on it rather than just mine as well. I've got a cross-section of people, and we had a number of people in the club use this who are both, I would say, lower intermediate level longsworders up to people who've been doing longsword for many, many years, and some people who've won a bunch of medals doing longsword and that kind of stuff. Overall, the impressions of this was that it was illuminating to use. There were certain things we thought about this that turned out to not be the case. The first thing is, so long as you have responsible adult fencers using it, it doesn't actually need to hit particularly hard. The mass of the sword obviously means that you're hitting with a heavier mass, but often you haven't accelerated the blade to as fast as you might do with another feather because it's a heavier sword. Because when you're actually fencing someone, your reaction times and everything else, and the delay built in to the fact that you can't move this quite as quickly as a normal one from whatever you've just done. So maybe you've just guard and then you riposte. You can't accelerate it so quickly. So actually you tend not to hit with as much force as you might think. So the fact that it's heavier isn't necessarily a safety problem at all. There were some issues, however, that came up about the point. Now this point, we have noted, is pretty damn thick, and you'll notice in terms of so-called distal taper, it gets thinner down here and then it gets thicker again at the end. Now we suspect that the original is not like that. I have seen at least a couple of original feathers myself, and they're quite thin at the end. So the distal taper continues all the way to the end and you end up with an almost sharp spatulate tip. Notice they probably weren't thrusting each other with these, they were probably slapping each other with the flats, but that's something I've ranted about in other videos. So the way that they were using feather or Paratschwert in period is probably quite different to how we expect to use them now. But anyway, the fact is therefore that we've got, I think, introduced mass up at the end here. That has two effects. Number one, it means that this sword is very tip heavy and sluggish to move. Secondly, it means that the sword is quite wobbly. It wobbles around a lot. And I don't know if you'll be able to see this on camera, but it has a very slow and cumbersome oscillation, and quite a big oscillation. So it's quite a floppy sword when you're moving it around. It doesn't feel particularly responsive. It doesn't feel very snappy. That said, it is beautifully put together, and I just really want to sing the praises of Victor Berbekucz manufacturing here. In that crossguard, just that crossguard alone, is beautifully done. The fit and the finish, the way that it goes in there is absolutely gorgeous. Very nicely finished. The pommel's a bit too shiny for my taste, and I'm not quite sure why it's that shiny. I prefer the satin finish of this than the really, it looks like almost like a doorknob. I'm not very keen on the pommel, but I love the crossguard. I love the fit and finish. There were no vibrations. The grip's very well done. The stitching's beautifully done down there. Nothing came loose or anything like that. One relatively minor constructional thing I will notice is I don't think this is the hardest steel. So this went up against a mixture of Reginiers and Covetons in sparring, and they seem to have scratched up the surface here. I am not squeezing this blade when I run my hand along here because there's a burr, both sides in fact. There's a burr, there's a burr. If I was to grip the blade tightly and drag my hand along, it would probably cut my hand slightly. Not badly, slightly. So this seems to be, there's a particularly nasty burr there. I don't know if I'll be able to get you to see it. Let's see if we can focus the camera on the blade. You can maybe just about see it there, but the camera's trying to focus on other things. It's just there. So this has only been used against other feather, and not much. That was only one evening, and it's already picked up a load of burrs on the blade, which honestly, with the edge this thick, I don't think is great. So I think the blade could be harder. So, in summary, this is nicely made, and I would not hesitate at all to buy something from Victor Berbekucz from VB Swordshop. They seem to be making really nice things. However, I do have some criticisms with this particular sword. Firstly, if it is a historical replica, the point of balance is really important to get right because it massively affects how the sword handles. So the fact that this should be 9 centimeters, 9 or 10 centimeters, and it's actually 15 centimeters, 50% difference, 50% increase rather, that is not good, okay? The point of balance should be where the point of balance should be. In terms of the point, I think too much mass has been introduced at the tip in terms of making it thicker. If you're going to make a historical replica and then you make it safer by making thicker at the tip, that kind of undermines the historical replica thing. Yes, it's 15 grams heavier than it should be. That's not very much. I don't worry too much about that. But overall, very nicely made. Is it useful? Now, this is the last interesting question I want to finish on. Is it useful to train with a historical replica that is not like a modern sporting feather made for the modern HEMA market? Yes, 100%. So I massively applaud what Roger Norling is doing, but also what VB Swordshop have done with this. I am 100%, in fact, they gave me a choice of which product to get sent to me. I am 100% in favour of trying out the historical tools that were actually used in period, rather than recreating a modern fencing tool that might be completely arbitrary and different to what they were trying to do with their fencing methods. That being said, remember that if you're going to use a historical training tool, a perfect replica of the original of this, for example, you also need to use historical rule sets. So that's just something to think about. That's, you know, a massive topic for another video, and I've covered it in the past and that kind of stuff. But for modern sporting HEMA fencing, you will want to continue using a modern HEMA sporting longsword, as featured by VB Swordshop and various other companies as well. That will suit your purposes better. However, if you are really into your longsword and you want to explore the parameters of historical longsword training, first of all, play with the historical rule sets. Secondly, do it with a historical tool that's modelled on an actual surviving original Paratschwert, like this, but just make sure that the point of balance is in the right place. I hope that's been a useful review. Thank you so much to VB Swordshop for sending this. Welcome to send me other things to review in the future, and that goes for any other manufacturers as well. I will give everyone equal footing, equal reviews, and you know, even where something, in this case, where I don't feel I'm the best person to necessarily be using it on screen, give it to some other people, get their impressions. I'll get a cross-section of views, and I hope that feedback has been useful to all of you watching this video. Thanks a lot, folks, and see you again soon. Cheers. Thanks for watching. We've got extra videos on Patreon. Please give our Facebook a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Cheers, folks.